Although kidnapping is comparatively rare, it's a particularly vicious crime, especially when it involves children. Sometimes kidnapping turns to murder. In the summer of 1874, 4-year-old Charlie Ross was snatched while playing with his brother on a pavement in Philadelphia. A few days later, a ransom demand for $20,000 arrived at his distraught parents' house. Charlie's father managed to scrape the money together and arranged a meeting with the kidnappers. But no one turned up. A $20,000 reward was offered for the child's recovery. 6 months later, following a police shootout in New York, a dying burglar confessed to kidnapping Charlie and said the child would be returned unharmed. But he wasn't, and the little boy was never seen again. Infamous Murders Now examines 3 more cases in which a kidnapping for ransom turned to tragedy. The first tells the story of the child of one of America's greatest living heroes. The second was a case of mistaken identity, as bungling kidnappers abducted the wrong woman. The third became one of Britain's most notorious crimes, the kidnapping of a 17-year-old girl. In 1932, Charles Lindbergh, known as the Lone Eagle, was the most famous man in America. 5 years earlier, in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, the intrepid aviator had become the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. But on the evening of the 1st of March 1932, Lindbergh's world fell apart when his 20-month-old baby son, Charles Jr., was kidnapped. The child was snatched from his nursery in the Lindbergh family's exclusive but isolated country house near the village of Hopewell, New Jersey. The shutters had been forced open, and the baby's cot lay empty. The intruder had used what looked like a homemade ladder to gain access to the baby's room. Once the police and press had been informed, they descended in force on the Lindbergh residence. The controlled but obviously distraught Lindbergh showed them a crudely written letter which had been left on the nursery radiator. It demanded a $50,000 ransom for the return of the baby and was signed with 2 strange interlocking circles. The biggest manhunt in the history of America was soon underway. Even President Herbert Hoover promised to do what he could to hunt down the kidnappers. Thousands of posters appealing for information were distributed across the US. Lindbergh was so desperate for the return of his child that he was determined to pay the ransom, much against the advice of the police. On the 9th of March, the kidnappers contacted Lindbergh and said they wanted to use Dr. John Condon as a go-between. The baby's pajamas were sent to Condon's house as proof of identity. Lindbergh now prepared to pay the ransom. On the evening of the 2nd of April, Lindbergh and Condon were told to go to a cemetery in the Bronx. There they handed $50,000 in gold certificate bills through a hedge and received a note back saying the baby was safe on a boat off Massachusetts. Lindbergh then spent the next few days flying up and down the coast, helped by the US Navy and Coast Guard. But they found nothing. Lindbergh had been duped. 6 weeks later, Lindbergh's worst nightmare came true. On the 12th of May, the decomposing body of his baby son was found just a few miles from the Lindbergh mansion. A post-mortem showed the child had died within a few hours of being snatched. 2 years later, on the 16th of September 1934, a petrol station attendant in New York noted down a car's registration plate when he was paid with a $10 gold certificate bill. The car belonged to Richard Bruno Hauptmann, a 34-year-old carpenter who lived in the Bronx. Police picked him up immediately. When they raided his house, police found almost $14,000 in gold bills stashed in his garage. Hauptmann was paraded before the press. He vehemently denied everything and said the money had come from a former business associate. But the police were convinced they had the man who had murdered the Lindbergh baby, especially when a handwriting expert matched him to the ransom note. Hauptmann's trial began on the 2nd of January 1935. He pleaded not guilty in front of a hostile court. There was a stir as Charles Lindbergh took the stand and described the visit to the cemetery to hand over the ransom. The evidence of the handwriting expert was of crucial importance, as he highlighted comparison points between Hauptmann's writing and the words on the ransom notes. The ladder used to reach the baby's bedroom was produced, and a government expert claimed it had been made from floorboards taken from Hauptmann's attic. Edward Riley, Hauptmann's lawyer, tried to discredit the prosecution's case.
The state has miserably failed to produce any evidence to connect him with the crime. They have not put him in the state of New Jersey on the night of March the 1st. They have not put him in the nursery. They have not put him in possession of the child.
But Riley's arguments were futile. On the 13th of February, Hauptmann was found guilty and sentenced to death.
Well, I want to tell the people of America that I am absolutely innocent of the crime of the murder. My conviction was a great surprise. I never saw the Lindbergh baby, and I never was in Hopewell or near Hopewell.
Despite the fact that the gold dollar certificate bills were still circulating while Hauptmann was in jail, the US Supreme Court refused to allow an appeal. He went to the electric chair on the 3rd of April 1936, proclaiming his innocence up to the last moment. 34 years later, the wife of a prominent newspaper executive was abducted from her London home and held for ransom. It was the first such recorded case in Britain for hundreds of years and caused a sensation at the time. As the new year dawned in 1970, police launched one of the most extensive hunts in British history for a missing person. They were searching for 55-year-old Mrs. Muriel Mackay, an Australian who came to London with her family in 1957. She had disappeared on the evening of the 29th of December 1969. Just before midnight, her husband received a call demanding £1 million ransom. Alec Mackay was deputy chairman of the News of the World. As the search for his wife intensified, it became apparent that the kidnappers had confused Mackay with fellow Australian Rupert Murdoch, who had bought the newspaper a few months earlier, and mistaken Mrs. Mackay for Murdoch's young wife, Anna. It wasn't long before posters appealing for information began to appear across London. The Mackay's son, Ian, was bewildered.
I mean, if my father had been a millionaire or something, I might have expected this to happen, or I might have not been so surprised, but I was absolutely stunned. I can't, it just doesn't seem to me, I can't see any reason for it at all.
The police investigation was headed by Chief Superintendent Wilfred Smith, a highly experienced murder detective. He was worried that any attempt to trap or dupe the kidnappers could lead to Mrs. Mackay's death. The family, clutching at straws, made what many thought a strange decision. They asked a close friend to visit a clairvoyant in Holland. Gerard Croiset had worked on dozens of police cases around the world and was well regarded. He said Mrs. Mackay was being held at a farm north of London, and he added ominously she'd be dead if not found within 2 weeks. Police searched the area described by Croiset but came up with nothing. Meanwhile, Alec Mackay had received several poignant letters from his wife begging him to cooperate with her captors. One such letter instructed their son Ian to bring £500,000 to a crossroads north of London. But the kidnappers failed to show up. Another meeting was arranged for the 6th of February. This time Alec and his daughter Diane were told to deliver the money in 2 suitcases. Disguised police officers took their place. Arriving at Epping by tube, they took a call from a public payphone, telling them to take a taxi and drop the ransom money off in Bishop Stortford, a few miles away. The suitcases were left, as instructed, on the pavement. Police officers concealed